Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends, and all supporters of African History Club. Welcome to episode number 30. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. So today I want to speak on China's economic footprints in Africa. Is China an imperial power in Africa? That is the question that's being widely debated. Obviously, the answer is no if we are talking about a military imperialist power, such as the United States, for example, which can decide to launch a war of aggression against a country like Libya in 2010, 2011, completely obliterate that country and send it back into the Stone Age era. China is not such an imperial power. But nonetheless, let's look at China's economic footprints. I think in order to understand why this issue is even debated, when we see massive Chinese economic penetration in Africa, where in many countries now it's in a dominant position when it comes to exploiting the minerals and natural resources, is because of China's unique history with Africa. We can go way back into the 14th, 15th century when kingdoms thrived on the east coast of Africa and in southern Africa, like the kingdom of Great Zimbabwe. And if you go back to that era, and some of the excavations have now revealed Chinese beads and porcelain dating back to the era of thriving trade between Africa and China that long ago. But in the modern era, I think the best time frame to start off is the 1960s. And that is, of course, a unique time in China's history and Africa's history as well. We're coming out of World War II. The world was evolving rapidly after the Second World War. China was throwing off imperialist powers, and then the Chinese Civil War, and Mao Zedong's Red Army prevails over Chiang Kai-shek's Western-supported Kuomintang, and the People's Republic of China is declared in 1949. India had won its independence in 1947. In 1955, we have the Bandung Conference in Indonesia. It's also referred to as the Afro-Asian Conference, brought about all these former countries that had been colonized as they discuss and try to chart an independent way so that they're not beholden to either the West or the East Bloc in the era after World War II. At that time, Zhou Enlai, who was Chairman Mao's right-hand person, later on, of course, Premier Zhou Enlai, got to meet Kwame Nkrumah for the first time. At that time, Ghana was not yet independent, but it had self-government, internal rule. So Kwame Nkrumah was the chief minister by 1955. Ghana, of course, did not win independence until 1957. And then most African countries started to rapidly gain their independence in the 1960s as well. China was looking for allies at that time. So China started to reach out to African countries. Zhou Enlai toured a number of African countries in 1963, 1964, and in 1965 met with Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. Nkrumah had already previously visited China, so he was reciprocating that visit. And amongst other things, they discussed Pan-African unity. China was a supporter of a concept of a United States of Africa. They discussed the Congo crises. By that time, Kwame Nkrumah, who had supported Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, had seen how Congo was torn apart with Belgium, the US, Britain, and other imperialist powers that imposed Mobutu Sese Seko in power by that time, having eliminated Patrice Lumumba. So China was very interested also in what was going on in the Congo. But China also wanted Kwame Nkrumah's support in order to gain a seat on the United Nations. By that time, Taiwan was still holding the Chinese seat at the United Nations. China did not become a member, People's Republic of China, until 1971, after which then it took over the seat and Taiwan was expelled. And a lot of that support came from African countries, voted in support of China's membership in the General Assembly of the United Nations. So a lot of the engagement between China and Africa during the 1960s was mostly ideological based. Brothers, comrades in political concept, withstanding Western aggression. But then one of the earliest commercial economic investments made by China was in Tanzania, when between 1970 to 1975, China helped build the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, also known as TAZARA, at a cost of more than $400 million, which in today's value would be almost 2.7 billion, closer to 3 billion US dollars. So that was China's most significant and largest investment by far in any overseas project at that time. And it was not surprising that China would do that for Tanzania, which at that time was led by Julius Nyerere, perhaps one of the greatest African statesmen, and certainly one of my favorite intellectual presidents, a committed socialist who was advocating and trying to build a system he called Ujamaa, African socialism, Tanzanian socialism. And why did he refer to it as Tanzanian socialism? Because he emphasized that coming from a communalistic tradition in Africa, where the extended family concept had always been paramount, he did not have to wait for a class struggle based emergence of socialism in Tanzania. He would just go back and take advantage of that familyhood communalism that is prevalent through most African countries. So they supported Julius Nyerere. And it was ideological based. Nyerere had first approached the former colonial power, Britain, and through Britain, the World Bank, for financing. And they denied him the financing. And this is one of the early indications that independence was not meant to be real in African countries. Superficial. The former colonial power did not mind if you call yourself presidents or prime ministers and you have your own individual flags. But when it comes to building independent economies, no way. So when Nyerere was denied, he went to China, and China built that railway. Great credit to China. And China was not yet an economic power in the 1960s, and that's also part of the reason why it could not give significant economic support to African countries. So for example, when Zhou Enlai visited with Kwame Nkrumah in 1965, China's per capita income was 98 US dollars, about that amount. Ghana's was 298 at that time. And the United States, just by comparison, was almost $3,000 by that time. But certainly things changed China did become a major power eventually. And another reason why China was very popular in Africa was because of China's support for the liberation struggle in African countries. Of course, many of the African countries won their independence much later, particularly the Portuguese colonies, and then, of course, South Africa itself, and what was then Rhodesia, and is now Zimbabwe. So in Zimbabwe, for example, during the liberation struggle, China supported with training and weapons the Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, which was led by Robert Mugabe. And the Soviet Union supported the Zimbabwe African People's Union, ZAPU, which was led by Joshua Nkomo. Later, of course, Mugabe and Nkomo teamed up their armies and fought under a joint command called the Patriotic Front. Ultimately went on to defeat the racist apartheid regime of Ian Smith in Rhodesia and liberated the country in 1980. So China was a significant supporter of that liberation struggle. And in South Africa, China supported the Pan-African Congress, the PAC. But China also had its own vested interests. So because of ideological reasons, it also found itself on the wrong side of history occasionally in Africa. After China's quarrel with the Soviet Union, they could not support joint efforts. So for example, given the liberation war in Angola, one of the main fighting forces, the force that ultimately formed the first post-colonial government, was the MPLA, led by Dr. Agostinho Neto, a committed Marxist, intellectual, poet. So because the MPLA was supported by the Soviet Union, China could not support the MPLA. So what does China do? China supported the FNLA, which was based in the Congo under Mobutu, the dictator who had been instrumental in killing Lumumba. And the FNLA was led by Holden Robato, who had been on the CIA payroll for decades. But nevertheless, China supported the FNLA simply because the Soviet Union was already supporting the MPLA. So I bring that out just as occasions where China was also occasionally on the wrong side in some of these struggles in Africa because of its ideological clash with the Soviet Union. Okay, so China's approach toward its economic dealings with Africa changes dramatically after the death of Chairman Mao in 1976. The China that followed the death of Chairman Mao was, of course, a more pragmatic China that integrated market-based elements in its economy in the post-Chairman Mao era, so that its focus on its dealings with Africa shifted away from aid and it became more focused on trade and economic investments. So for example, let me give you some brief statistics. In 1980, when the pace started picking up, the value of China's trade with African countries, the total was $1 billion. That's 1980. By 2000, the value was $10 billion. But hang on. By 2010, a mere 10 years later, that value was $114 billion. By 2008, China surpassed the United States as Africa's major trading partner and surpassed France as well. France, Britain, these were the major trading partners by virtue of having been the former colonial powers and then the U.S. later superseded these two colonial powers. But then in 2008, China superseded the United States. And in 2019, the most recent data that I looked up, China-Africa trade total value was $192 billion. And China, of course, imports natural resources, mineral resources from Africa, such as copper, such as manganese, such as uranium, and many other mineral products from Africa. And its main exports to Africa, manufactured products. So let me touch on some features of what is perhaps dramatically different between China's economic engagement with Africa and compared to the West, for example. China has extended billions of dollars in low interest loans to African countries, extended credit lines to African countries, and provided grants to African countries, billions of dollars. There were two occasions in 2015 and on 2018 when China held a Africa-China summit, which has been an occasional summit now, held in China. And on both occasions, extended $60 billion in a combination of loans, grants, and credit line to African countries. So we are talking $120 billion on those two occasions. And that does not even include the bilateral arrangements that China has with individual African countries for specific projects. So that is one thing that sets China apart from the Western countries and their dealings with African countries. Of course, occasionally African countries negotiate loans through institutions that are controlled by the West, such as the World Bank and the IMF. And those loans, of course, notorious for coming with economic conditionalities, such as no subsidies for education, for health care, no investments in manufacturing. And these are some of the issues. And then, of course, cutting the budget, which means laying off hundreds of thousands of public service employees across African countries. The Chinese loans do not have these conditionalities. However, the criticism of these loans is that it sets African countries into what is a debt trap, meaning China knows that at some point African countries would experience a debt crisis, and then China would ask that these loans be converted into equity. So China would take an interest, perhaps even a controlling interest, in some of Africa's the mines, concessions in the mines, or even utilities, the country's national utilities. So that has been the criticism of these of the loans, the credits lines from China in African countries. And another feature that has also been criticized is that when China is involved in major construction projects, whether it's in mining, whether it's building the railways, building the roads, building buildings and other infrastructure, China comes not only with technicians and managers, but also with laborers, which deprives African workers of job opportunities and the ability to acquire skills. So let me give you some data that I imagine are probably outdated by now, given the COVID pandemic. I don't imagine a lot of these construction projects are ongoing. But at one point, in Angola, there were 23,000 workers who had been brought in from China for specific projects that were being undertaken by China in Angola. So obviously, one can say that this is depriving 23,000 Angolans of employment opportunity. Not 23,000, not all of these can be managers and technicians. So let's say, even if, let's say 10% were technical people, so 2,300, you're still depriving more than 20,000 Angolans of employment opportunity by this type of arrangement. And in Nigeria, 12,000 Chinese workers and, I suppose, technicians. Zambia, 9,000. Kenya, 9,000. Ethiopia, 8,000. So these are just a few of the African countries with massive influx of Chinese workers. Another feature, so obviously that's been a issue of contention and even of resentment in African countries. And another thing that China has done in recent years is China has encouraged its citizens to migrate to Africa, to relocate to Africa. Why? Because obviously China has a massive population pressure, and the competitiveness in business, whether it's small-scale business in China, has reduced the profitability, the profit margin. Whereas in African countries, Africa still has 60% of the world's uncultivated arable land. So when Chinese go to Africa, they really sing its praises, and it's like paradise to many of the Chinese that go there. And I'm not just saying this out of the top of my head. I've been watching a lot of the, reading a lot and watching a lot of the videos that document some of the Chinese families that have relocated to Africa. And at the end, I'll mention one of the YouTube videos that I suggest people interested should take a look at. So in terms of the debt is an issue. Africa's total debt to the outside world as of 2019 was more than $400 billion. Zambia's alone was $23 billion. And out of that, $3 billion is to China. Zambia actually defaulted on interest payment on its total debt in November 2020. And Zambia is not the only African country. Given with the COVID pandemic and its decimation of many African economies, with the collapse of tourism, the collapse of export industry, many African countries are facing the similar pressure. Ethiopia, the Prime Minister Abiy had written an op-ed earlier on in the New York Times asking for debt relief or debt cancellation. And the industrialized wealthy countries were only willing to postpone payment on the interest, not interested in canceling the debt, which is, of course, the right thing that needs to be done. We could actually devote a whole podcast on that issue, and perhaps I actually will in the near future, because that is something that we need to focus on and to make sure it happens. Given the collapse of economies in many of these countries, the collapse in the healthcare systems, collapse in education systems, we can't expect African countries with a reduced income level to devote a significant portion of that to repay the foreign debt. But that's an issue for another discussion. So these are some of the pressures that the engagement with China has produced in African countries. One of the documentaries that I actually recommend is Zambia Under Chinese Influence. And that was produced by France 24 Media, which of course has its own vested interest in trying to undermine China for the sake of France. Of course, as we know, France is notorious imperial power, military and economic, in West Africa. I'm glad to see that West Africans, particularly the younger generation, are now fighting that, and they seem to be getting some good reaction, and some concessions seem to be coming from France, and I hope they continue with that fight. So I point that out to just say that France, of course, would have a vested interest in this short documentary, but it's still worth watching because you actually will hear what some of the Zambians themselves say about China's involvement in Africa and in Zambia specifically. But the ironic thing is that, for example, some of them complain about Chinese cultural imperialism with pointing to signs that are in Chinese, for example, in Zambia. And ironically, they're complaining in English, which is, of course, a language that was brought by an imperial power as well. So I just wanted to point that irony out. But they do also make valid criticism. For example, the Chinese individuals that have relocated to Zambia, some of them have started enterprises. So let me give you an example of one. Chicken farming. It's undermined the domestic production of chicken in Zambia because Zambians do not use hormones. They don't use chemical feeds. They feed their chicken on natural grains, so they take longer to be ready to be sold in the market. And by that time, the Chinese have produced several cycles of I think the Zambians call them GMO chickens. And that has, of course, generated some resentment as well. In fact, some Zambians are demanding for a tax on the Chinese chickens that are fed with hormones and that are brought to market within four weeks, I think, as the Zambians say. So these are some of the elements. I think at the end of the day, I go back to what the late Professor Samir Amin said. So it does not matter where the capital is going to come from. So China will be happy to give African countries hundreds of millions of dollars in return for their resources. And the ball is in the court of the African countries. As Samir Amin said, you must negotiate contracts, arrangements that demand a transfer of technology so that you are now capable of processing your natural resources within your own country. So now you're creating jobs. Now you're adding value to those minerals that you now export lump wholesale to the rest of the world. And you basically sell it for peanuts. By acquiring the technology, by processing those minerals within your own country, not only are you generating jobs, but the output become input in other industries within your country, and they keep multiplying. Output becomes another industry's input, becomes another industry's output, becomes input, or is consumed locally, or is exported as a finished product with enhanced added value, which earns you more in the international market. So that's one thing Samir Amin said. In addition to that, regional integration. So now you're exporting your products to regional markets, and you're importing from those regional markets as well. That's how you have autonomous domestic economies that are geared to the demands of your population, not to the outside world first. The outside world should be secondary when you ultimately export to the outside world. So I'm a big believer in the Samir Amin model. So for that reason, I also recommend the YouTube video, Tackling Africa's Industrialization Challenge. And industrialization is spelled the English way. So instead of a Z with a S, and that's also on YouTube. So I think I've covered the bare basic elements, and clearly, if it's a matter of economic imperialism, yes, China is a new economic imperial power in Africa. It's not the aggressive hegemon militaristic power such as the United States and France and Britain and the other NATO countries that have been decimating Africa with military imperialism. But unless Africa is economically independent, Africa will always be taken advantage of, not only by the West, but clearly in this case, by China as well. That brings us to a close of episode number 30. Thank you so much, comrades, friends, sisters, and brothers. In my next episode, I will be looking at U.S. military presence in African countries. Stay well, stay healthy. Thank you.